In 1980, Lamborghini didn't have enough money to keep the lights on. The company that built the Miura and the Countach, cars that an entire generation of kids put on their bedroom walls, was declared bankrupt and handed over to a court-appointed receiver. Fewer than a few hundred employees showed up to a factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese, not knowing if there would be a payroll to meet at the end of the month, let alone a company left to work for by the end of the year. The assembly lines that had built some of the most desirable cars on the planet a decade earlier were now collateral in a bankruptcy court, and the Raging Bull badge on the hood was, for the moment, worth more as nostalgia than as a business. 44 years later, in 2024, that same company posted revenue of just over €3 billion. It was the first time in its history it had ever crossed that number, and it did it with a profit margin higher than almost anyone else in the entire luxury goods industry, higher than most fashion houses, higher than most jewelers. Between those two moments sits one decision, a decision so unpopular inside the car world that when Lamborghini first showed it to the public, longtime fans openly said it would kill the brand for good. Instead, it did the opposite. This is the story of how a Lamborghini SUV, the one car purists said should never have worn the badge, ended up being the only reason there's still a badge left to argue about. The question worth answering isn't whether the Urus counts as a real Lamborghini. Enthusiasts have been arguing about that since 2012, and they'll keep arguing about it long after this video ends. The more interesting question is how a single risky product line took a company that could barely sell 1,000 cars a year and turned it into one of the most profitable car manufacturers on Earth, without losing the exclusivity that made people want a Lamborghini in the first place. To understand how big a gamble the Urus really was, you have to go back to how fragile Lamborghini still was, even decades after it stopped nearly going bankrupt regularly. Ferruccio Lamborghini made his first fortune building tractors out of surplus military engines after the Second World War, long before he ever built a car. He founded the company in 1963 out of pure spite, after a dispute with Enzo Ferrari over a clutch complaint, and for a brief stretch in the late 1960s the gamble worked. The Miura, launched in 1966, is still credited with inventing the modern mid-engine supercar layout. But the good years didn't last. The 1973 oil crisis gutted demand for gas-guzzling exotic cars almost overnight, and Ferruccio sold his remaining stake and walked away from the company for good in 1974. What followed was close to 2 decades of chaos. Between 1980 and 1998, Lamborghini changed hands 5 separate times. Swiss financiers, the American Chrysler Corporation, a Malaysian investment group, and an Indonesian conglomerate. Each new owner arrived with big plans for the brand, and each one eventually gave up and walked away. By 1998, the company was so financially strained that its Malaysian owner, a firm called Megatech, sold it to Audi for a reported $110 million. That's a sum that wouldn't buy a mid-sized shopping centre in most American cities, for a company whose name was already worth far more than its balance sheet. Audi's ownership changed everything, but slowly. German engineering discipline and German capital gave Lamborghini something it had never really had before: consistency. In 2003, the Gallardo arrived, a smaller, more attainable V10 supercar built in far higher numbers than anything Lamborghini had made before it. For the first time, the company had a genuine volume model, instead of a handful of hand-built exotics rolling out one at a time. Sales climbed steadily through the 2000s, nearly tenfold from where they had been a decade earlier, peaking in 2007 and 2008. Then, the global financial crisis hit every luxury manufacturer at once, and Lamborghini's growth stalled right along with everyone else's. But the point stands. Under Audi, Lamborghini had gone from a company nobody expected to survive the decade to a stable, profitable, prestigious name again. That stability is exactly what makes the next part of the story so strange. The company kept recovering through the 2000s and 10s. The Aventador replaced the aging Murcielago in 2011. The Huracan replaced the Gallardo in 2014. By 2016, Lamborghini posted a new sales record: 3,457 cars in a single year, its best result since Ferruccio Lamborghini founded the company in 1963. On paper, that looked like total success. A company that had been left for dead in 1980 was setting records under new ownership. But look closer at that number and a different problem shows up. 3,457 cars sold across the entire planet, from a company that needed hundreds of millions of euros in engineering investment every single year just to keep two model lines competitive against Ferrari and McLaren. Lamborghini wasn't dying anymore, but it also wasn't really growing. Not in the way a business needs to grow to be worth owning for the long term. It was a prestige asset. Profitable in good years, exposed in bad ones, and entirely dependent on a tiny pool of ultra-wealthy buyers who could disappear the moment the next downturn hit. One bad recession, and the whole thing could be right back where it started in 1980. Executives inside Volkswagen Group, Audi's own parent company, had started asking a question that had nothing to do with horsepower. If the goal was to turn Lamborghini into a real, durable business, instead of a beautiful and occasionally profitable hobby, something fundamental had to change. On April 23, 2012, at the Beijing Auto Show, Lamborghini showed the answer. It was called the Urus. 4 doors, 4 seats, a name borrowed from a wild ancestor of domestic cattle, and a body that towered over every other car on Lamborghini's stand that day. Stefan Winkelmann, the company's president and CEO at the time, told reporters exactly what it was for. The Urus is the Lamborghini of SUVs. Inside the company, the idea was far from unanimous. Winkelmann later admitted the concept took years of internal convincing before anyone would sign off on actually building it. A small brand cannot allow failure, he said, describing the pressure of betting a company that had already gone bankrupt once on a product with nothing in common with the two-door supercars that built its name. There was a precedent sitting right inside the same corporate family, and it's worth keeping in mind because it comes back up later. A decade earlier, Porsche had launched the Cayenne to widespread purist outrage of its own, and that unloved SUV ended up generating the cash that kept the 911 alive and independent. Lamborghini's own parent group had already watched this exact playbook work once before. The business case, once it finally got approved, moved fast. Lamborghini committed to nearly doubling the size of its Sant'Agata Bolognese factory, adding a dedicated new production line and roughly 500 new jobs, a massive expansion for a company that had spent decades building fewer than 2,000 cars a year combined. The Urus would share its underlying architecture with the Audi Q7, the Porsche Cayenne, and the Bentley Bentayga, the same Volkswagen Group platform strategy that had already quietly funded half the luxury SUV market, without most buyers ever noticing. That last detail is the one that set off the backlash. To purists, sharing a platform with an Audi wasn't a shrewd cost-saving decision. It was proof that Lamborghini had sold out completely. Online forums and car magazines spent years mocking the Urus before it had even reached production, calling it a modified Volkswagen Touareg wearing a $200,000 body kit. Some questioned whether the company even deserved to call itself a supercar maker anymore, now that its lineup included something with a back seat and cup holders. Lamborghini didn't back down, and it didn't apologize. The price was set high, north of $200,000, specifically to keep the car out of reach for anyone but the same wealthy buyers the brand already courted. The pitch internally was never that the Urus would replace the two-door cars. It was that the Urus would fund them and protect them from ever having to compromise on price or exclusivity again. By 2017, the year before Urus deliveries even began, Lamborghini had already posted 3,815 cars sold, a 51% jump that was as much anticipation as it was actual demand for the existing lineup. Production of the Urus finally started in the late spring of 2018, after 6 years of design work, factory expansion, and internal arguing. Nobody, not even the executives who had approved it, knew yet whether wealthy buyers would actually show up for a Lamborghini with a back seat. They showed up faster than the factory could handle. Dealers as far away as Malaysia had waiting lists before the car had even cleared customs, and Lamborghini's own staff admitted publicly that the main factory in Italy was struggling to keep pace with demand from every region at once. By the end of 2018, even with barely half a year of deliveries, Lamborghini sold 5,750 cars in total, a 51% jump over the year before. The Urus alone accounted for 1,761 of them. 1 in every 3 Lamborghinis sold that year was already the SUV nobody thought would sell. Then 2019 happened. A full calendar year of Urus production pushed Lamborghini's total sales past 8,200 cars, nearly doubling the company's entire output in just 2 years. The Urus alone delivered almost 5,000 units, a number that nearly matched Lamborghini's entire sales volume from the year before the SUV had even existed. Stefano Domenicali, the company's chairman and CEO at the time, didn't hide how big a shift it was. The year 2019 was the most successful in our history. But a strange new problem arrived along with all that growth. Roughly 70% of Urus buyers had never owned a Lamborghini before in their lives. A company that had spent decades carefully building relationships with a small, tight circle of wealthy enthusiasts suddenly had thousands of brand new customers it had never marketed to, never sold to, and didn't fully understand yet. That meant building out an entirely new kind of dealership experience almost overnight, one built around families and daily usability instead of track days and weekend toys. It meant training service departments to handle school runs and airport pickups instead of just track inspections. A company that had spent its whole existence selling a fantasy now had to sell comfort, practicality and reliability to people cross-shopping it against a Range Rover, without ever once sounding like it was apologizing for what it used to be. That wasn't the only problem. Every rival luxury manufacturer had watched what Lamborghini's SUV did to its bottom line, and none of them wanted to be left behind. Aston Martin launched the DBX in 2020. Ferrari, a brand that had spent decades publicly insisting it would never build an SUV, finally caved and released the Purosangue in 2022. Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Maserati, all of them either already had one or were rushing to build one. The entire ultra-luxury car market was suddenly racing to copy a strategy that had been mocked as a betrayal just a few years earlier. Remember the Porsche Cayenne comparison from a few minutes ago? By the early 2020s, it wasn't a comparison anymore. It was the entire industry's business model. Then came 2020 itself, and the pandemic knocked sales down across the entire industry, Lamborghini included. Factories in Italy shut down for weeks, and the global chip shortage that followed hit every manufacturer's production line right as demand was starting to recover. The recovery that followed through 2021 and 2022 was steep anyway, but it came with a harder question buried underneath it. Lamborghini now had to keep 2 completely different identities alive under one badge at the same time. A razor-focused 2-door supercar division that still had to feel rare and untouchable, and a growing SUV business that had to keep scaling without cannibalizing the very exclusivity the supercars depended on. On top of that, the Urus itself couldn't just stand still. New emissions rules across Europe and a wave of quicker, more powerful rivals meant the SUV that had saved the company needed saving of its own, over and over again. The Urus S and the higher output Urus Performante arrived in 2023, and in November 2024 the car went hybrid entirely, launching as the Urus SE with an 800 horsepower electrified powertrain. Plenty of the same purists who had never accepted the original SUV now had a second thing to be upset about: a Lamborghini running partly on a battery. The accountants in Sant'Agata had long since stopped worrying about what the purists thought. By 2023, the company had already delivered more than 9,200 cars in a single year, a number that would have sounded completely absurd for a brand that sold barely 1,000 units annually as recently as 2010. The record 2024 numbers came at the end of an 18-month stretch, where Lamborghini rebuilt its entire lineup from the ground up. The Revuelto arrived first, the company's first V12 hybrid supercar. The Urus SE followed. Then, at Monterey Car Week in August 2024, came the Temerario, the V8 hybrid replacement for the Huracan. None of that product overhaul happens on the balance sheet of a company still surviving on a few thousand supercar sales a year. It happens because a super SUV had spent 6 years quietly funding it. Then came the number that mattered most. In 2024, Lamborghini delivered 10,687 cars worldwide. Revenue hit €3.09 billion. For the first time in company history, It crossed the 3 billion mark. Operating profit reached 835 million euros. Margin held at 27%, among the highest of any luxury manufacturer on the planet, supercar or otherwise. More than half of every single car sold that year, 5,662 units, was the Urus. Growth came from everywhere at once. The Americas, Lamborghini's largest region, grew again. Europe, the Middle East and Africa grew again. Asia Pacific grew again. A company that used to live or die on the buying habits of a single wealthy region was now growing across 3 continents simultaneously, exactly the kind of stability a 2-model supercar maker could never have built on its own. The gamble had paid for itself many times over. Then 2025 tested it. Revenue still grew, up to roughly 3.2 billion euros, and deliveries hit a fresh record of 10,747 cars, the 3rd straight year above the 10,000 unit mark. But operating income slipped to 768 million euros, and margin fell to 24%. Currency swings and new American tariffs ate into profit the company had spent over a decade building back up. Even the business the Urus built wasn't immune to the outside world. Lamborghini's answer was the same one it always gives when conditions get harder. Sell fewer cars if you have to, but sell the ones you do sell richer. In 2025, 94% of every car delivered left the factory personalized in some way, and every single customization option added margin that a standard, off-the-shelf model never could. So what actually turned a nearly bankrupt Italian car company into one of the most profitable manufacturers in the world? It came down to 3 decisions that most people, including plenty of Lamborghini's own fans, got wrong at the time. First, the belief that exclusivity and survival were the same thing turned out to be false. Lamborghini's supercars stayed just as rare and just as expensive after the Urus arrived as they were before it. The SUV didn't dilute that scarcity, it funded it. Second, the platform sharing that purists hated the most was exactly what made the entire bet affordable in the first place. Building a bespoke, low-volume SUV entirely from scratch would have bankrupted the company faster than any recession ever could. Sharing an architecture with Audi and Porsche is what let Lamborghini keep its actual supercars pure, expensive and hand-built. Third, and this is the part that still surprises people when they hear the full numbers, the biggest threat to a small luxury brand was never diluting the badge. It was the badge no longer existing at all to dilute. Company that had already gone bankrupt once and passed through 5 different owners trying to keep it alive, understood that math better than anyone standing outside the showroom shouting about betrayal. The purists were never entirely wrong. The Urus really did share its bones with an Audi and a Bentley. It really did put a back seat and a set of cup holders on a badge that used to mean nothing but 2 doors and a V12. But the alternative to that compromise wasn't a pure Lamborghini. It was very likely no Lamborghini at all.